So, how would I describe myself? I'm an aging academic, and I've always been an academic, and I guess that sounds pretty boring, but actually it's been a pretty interesting ride, partly because I've moved around a lot in the nature of my interests, partly also because of the political involvements, and I've always tried to link together the academic side of what I'm doing with political work. I'm not an organizer, but on the other hand I do like to talk with people who are engaging in politics on the street and in the community and at large. So that dialogue has been very, very helpful to me, and I've always liked to keep it going. And in fact, I'd say in some ways that some of my best ideas have come out of interactions with people who've been involved in street politics and who see things in ways which are very different from, say, normal academic ways of seeing. My name is David Harvey. When I was a kid, Britain still had an empire, and it was very, very common for people to imagine that they would have a life in the empire. And so that got me very interested in other countries, other lands, and I'd always wanted to travel. In the end, I think I decided it was easier to travel intellectually than it was to do so physically. So by either bad luck or good luck, I failed to get into Her Majesty's Navy. And so I traveled the world in terms of my interest in, well, what's going on in different parts of the world, which led me into geography as a career. The idea of an ideal city, utopia, I think came to me rather late on in life, and it was really coming out of the question everybody would ask me, which is, well, you have a lot of criticisms of how the society currently exists, but when are you going to tell us what this other alternative society would look like? And I think at that point I thought I should be more proactive in trying to define what the alternative might look like, and of course that led immediately into all of those attempts historically to try to think about alternative societies, to think about utopias. And most utopias of the first sort are really about new cities. So the connection between utopias and cities also arose because I was increasingly interested towards the end of the first phase of my life, if you want to call it that. I increasingly became interested in cities. Initially I was interested in agriculture and rural kind of questions, and it was only when I was in my 30s that I started to get very interested in cities and switch my framework of interest, if you like, from rural life to urban life. I think the most important thing to me is, personally, is to try to invent new ideas and to do it in a way that other people can understand and maybe even act upon. At the same time, I don't want to imagine that somehow or other I'm some sort of guru who kind of has all of the answers. So I think the other thing that's terribly important to me is to try to put myself in a position where I listen to what other people are saying and then try to reformulate it and articulate it in a way which is sometimes more about their vision than it is about my vision. So it's a what I would call a dialectical mode of inquiry. That is, that listening to others, you can get some sense of what their idea of an ideal society might be like. And sometimes people are not quite able to articulate it. And one of the most important things to me is to try to articulate what others are saying and give it a shape and a form that they hadn't quite themselves realized. That to me is the most satisfying thing, when people say things like, well, I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I never quite thought about it that way, and finally that's how I was thinking about it all along. And that seems to me to be, it gives me terrific pleasure when that happens. We all live in a world where money is terribly important, and I lived in a family where we were not rich. We were, very close to the margins. My father was unemployed in the 1930s, and so lived in very difficult situations. And so we were always extremely careful about money. And I became aware very early on that we had to be careful about what we spent our money on. I was taught the virtue of savings at a very early age. I had a little piggy bank and I was supposed to put money in it, and I did. And then every now and again I would get the money out and I would spend it on something, but it was always, I had to think about very carefully what I might spend it on. And I also became very aware early on of my parents, my grandparents all had an abhorrence of being in debt. And the only thing you could go in debt for was to buy a house and have a mortgage and pay it off. And then the great moment came when finally you became the owner. But I was basically taught never get in debt, always try and have a surplus. And this is, of course, very much at odds with the contemporary way of being in the world, where I'm surrounded by people who think nothing whatsoever of spending immense amounts on their credit cards, not even thinking about how it's going to be paid for. But I was raised to be very, very careful about money. So money to me was something that was precious and important. You should have it, but you should always take care of it. Whatever situation we are in, be it personal, in the family, in institutions, in job situations, you can never see yourself as purely autonomous, and I would never even want to. It always seems to me that the social relations that you have are very much about who you are, and so there is an understanding of autonomy which is about autonomy arising out of relations with others rather than simply going it on your own. Capitalism, and then there's capital, and I think I like to differentiate between the two. Capitalism is a society that is dominated by capital. And capital is really simply a process by which people use money to make more money. That's the simplest definition you can give. Now, the various ways in which you can make more money, the way in which industrial capitalism has worked for the last 200 years is that you buy labor power, and you buy means of production like machinery and raw materials, and you put the labor power and the raw materials together under the command of a capitalist. You use a technology and you make a new product, and you sell that new product for the original money you laid out and a profit. And then you take the profit at the end of the day, and typically what you do is you have to reinvest part of it in expansion. So a capitalist is always about making more. And it's not because they're greedy, but because the nature of the system, which is competitive, means that if I don't reinvest and make more, then somebody else will invest and make more and I will no longer be a capitalist. So capital is this process. Of course, not everything that happens in society is like that. I mean, personal relations are not based on that necessarily. So, but the society we live in, I mean, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the restaurants we go to are essentially all organized as capitalist enterprises, organized in that kind of way. So our society is dominated by the circulation of capital in which money is being used to make more money. Zero growth is about not expanding my production. That is, if you could imagine suddenly all capitalists would become socialists and they'd all agree that they were not going to expand production anymore, so they would not grow, and we would have zero growth. But that would not necessarily mean that society would be organized in a way that there would not be change. In fact, there could be a lot of changes going on. There could be redistributions, and there could be new forms of development. And I think of development as being about the development of new human capacities and powers. And the development of new capacities and powers do indeed require that we have enough food in our stomach and we have enough air to breathe and enough water to drink. But it doesn't need perpetual growth in order to develop human capacities and powers. We can make very beautiful things, we can make beautiful pictures, we can make beautiful films, we can make all kinds of beautiful things without necessarily going into some sort of growth syndrome, which is so typical of what capital is about. There have been many predictions, of course, about the end of capitalism. And most of them have turned out to be wrong. So it's very dangerous, it seems to me, to sort of ever say, well, capitalism is over. One of the great things about this form that I've talked about of making money is that it turns out there are many different ways to make money, many different kinds of new products that can be brought online. So capitalism as a system is extremely flexible and extremely dynamic, and you never know where it is likely to go to next. So it could have been that in the crisis of 1873, Marx or some others might have said, oh, well, this is the end of capitalism. But here we are, sort of 140 years later, and it's still with us. So we don't want to talk about it as somehow or other automatically ending. But what I think we do see is that it is changing in I think, quite dramatic and significant ways. And some of the changes suggest that there are certain limits that it is encountering, that the continual growth is harder and harder to sustain, given the physical resources of planet Earth, given the amount of waste which is now being injected into the environment, given also the question of the market. Where is the market going to come from? And which is going to be sort of so sufficient to absorb the continual expansion of output. So we've actually seen new investment strategies over the last 30 years which are more and more about investing in fictions rather than actual facts, and that seems to me to be suggesting that capital, if it's going to survive, is going to survive as much as it can by creating fictions rather than by actually creating things. Fictitious capital is the kind of capital that arises when a capitalist gets a rate of return on their investment without actually producing anything. See, historically the idea was that capitalists made their money and got their rate of return out of producing things. But when it becomes harder and harder to produce things, you look for other ways in which to get your rate of return. For example, capital has always used certain things, always had certain fictitious forms. A mortgage on a house is a fictitious form of capital. That is, a banker has money to lend and wants to get a rate of return on it, wants to get 5% rate of return. I want to buy a house, so I say to the banker, well, please lend me $100,000 so I can buy this house. So the banker lends it to me, and then I pay back the $100,000 plus the 5% or 6% or whatever it is over a period of 30 years. So to the banker this looks like capital, but I'm not actually producing anything in the house. I'm actually just consuming the house. So this is a form of fictitious capital. National debt is a form of fictitious capital. The state borrows money to go to war or do something of that kind. And this then gives it a fictitious character. So there are many forms of fictitious capital that have been around for a very long time, but over the last 30 years, new forms of fictitious capital have come into being, particularly things like credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, collateralized debt obligations. You can now actually make capital by betting on the weather and what the weather will be in a year's time, or you can make capital by carbon trading in pollution rights, for instance. Now, these are fictitious markets, and so we see more and more fictitious markets occurring to us right now. And I think this is a very important shift that's occurring in the dynamics of what capitalism is about. There are certain kinds of investments which are not in production at all, but they're in the control of assets. For example, I invest in a property. I buy a property. Because I invest in a property prices go up. And other people who have some extra money say, oh, it looks to me like this is a good investment, so I'll invest in property. So they invest and the property prices go up some more. And then other people suddenly think, well, this is a great thing, so we all get into the property market. So this is how a bubble gets going, and it can happen in housing markets, it can happen in land markets, it can happen on silver futures, it can happen almost anywhere. And as the prices go up, so people begin to believe that the prices will go up forever. For instance, we saw that happening in, for instance, the United States housing market. After 2001, prices went up and everybody said, oh, this looks good, and then people invested more and more. And so property prices went from, I don't know, $500,000 in Manhattan to $1 million in Manhattan in about 10 years. And people started to make a lot of money out of investing in property. So that is how the bubble goes. It goes up and up and up and up and up until somebody one day kind of says, well, you know, all this property is worth millions and millions and millions, but the people living in it don't seem to have enough money to really pay for it. And then the bubble bursts.